A Voyage to Brobdingnag, Chapter 1. Having been condemned by nature and fortune to an active and restless life, in 2 months after my return I again left my native country, and took shipping in the Downs on the 20th day of June, 1702, in the Adventure, Captain John Nicholas, a Cornish man, commander, bound for Strout. We had a very prosperous gale till we arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, where we landed for fresh water, but discovering a leak, we unshipped our goods and wintered there. For the captain falling sick of an ague, we could not leave the Cape till the end of March. We then set sail and had a good voyage till we passed the Straits of Madagascar. But having got northward of that island at about 5 degrees south latitude, the winds, which in those seas are observed to blow a constant equal gale between the north and west from the beginning of December to the beginning of May, on the 19th of April began to blow with much greater violence and more westerly than usual, continuing so for 20 days together, during which time we were driven a little to the east of the Molucca Islands, and about 3 degrees northward of the line, as our captain found by an observation he took the 2nd of May, at which time the wind ceased, and it was perfect calm, whereat I was not a little rejoiced. But he, being a man well experienced in the navigation of those seas, bid us all prepare against a storm, which accordingly happened the day following, for a southern wind, called the southern monsoon, began to set in. Finding it was likely to overblow, we took in our spritsail and stood by to hand the foresail, but making foul weather, we looked the guns were all fast, and handed the mizzen. The ship lay very broad off, so we thought it better spooning before the sea. Then trying our hulling, we reefed the foresail and set him. We hauled aft the foresail. The helm was a hard weather. The ship wore bravely. We belayed the fore-down haul, but the sail was split, and we hauled down the yard, and got the sail into the ship, and unbound all the things clear of it. It was a very fierce storm. The sea broke strange and dangerous. We hauled off upon the lanyard of the whipstaff, and helped the man at helm. We would not get down our topmasts, but let all stand, because she scudded before the sea very well, and we knew that the topmast being aloft, the ship was the wholesomer, and made better way through the sea, seeing we had sea room. When the storm was over, we set foresail and mainsail, and brought the ship to. Then we set the mizzen, main topsail, and the foretopsail. Our course was east-northeast. The wind was at southwest. We got the starboard tacks abroad. We cast off our weather braces and lifts. We set in the lee braces, hauled forward by the weather bowlings, and hauled them tight, and belayed them, and handed over the mizzen tack to windward, and kept her full and by as near as she would lie. During this storm, which was followed by a strong wind west-southwest, we were carried by my computation about 500 leagues to the east, so that the oldest sailor on board could not tell in what part of the world we were. Our provisions held out well. Our ship was staunch, and our crew all in good health, but we lay in the utmost distress for water. We thought it best to hold on the same course, rather than turn more northwardly, which might have brought us to the northwest parts of Great Tartary, and into the frozen sea. On the 16th day of June, 1703, a boy on the topmast discovered land. On the 17th we came in full view of a great island or continent, for we knew not whither, on the south side whereof was a small neck of land jutting out into the sea, and a creek too shallow to hold a ship of above 100 tons. We cast anchor within a league of the creek, and our captain sent a dozen of his men well armed in the longboat, with vessels for water if any could be found. I desired his leave to go with them, that I might see the country, and make what discoveries I could. When we came to land, we saw no river or spring, nor any sign of inhabitants. Our men therefore wandered on the shore to find out some fresh water near the sea, and I walked alone about a mile on the other side, where I observed the country all barren and rocky. I now began to be weary, and seeing nothing to entertain my curiosity, I returned gently down towards the creek, and the sea being full in my view, I saw our men already got into the boat and rowing for life to the ship. I was going to holler after them, although it had been to little purpose, when I observed a huge creature walking over after them in the sea, and took prodigious strides. But our men had the start of him, half a league, and the sea thereabouts being full of sharp-pointed rocks, the monster was not able to overtake the boat. This I was afterwards told, for I durst not stay to see the issue for that adventure, but ran as fast as I could the way I first went, and then climbed up a steep hill, which gave me some prospect of the country. I found it fully cultivated, but that which first surprised me was the length of the grass, which in those grounds that seemed to be kept for hay was about 20 feet high. I fell into a high road, for so I took it to be, though it served to the inhabitants only as a footpath through a field of barley. Here I walked on for some time, but could see little on either side, it being now near harvest, and the corn rising at least 40 foot. I was an hour walking to the end of this field, which was fenced in with a hedge of at least 120 foot high, and the trees so lofty that I could make no computation of their altitude. There was a stile to pass from this field to the next. It had 4 steps and a stone to cross over when you came to the uppermost. It was impossible for me to climb this stile, because every step was 6 foot high, and the upper stone above 20. I was endeavoring to find some gap in the hedge when I discovered one of the inhabitants in the next field, advancing toward the stile, of the same size with him whom I saw in the sea pursuing our boat. He appeared as tall as an ordinary spire steeple, and took about 10 yards at every stride, as near as I could guess. I was struck with the utmost fear and astonishment, and ran to hide myself in the corn, from whence I saw him at the top of the stile, looking back into the next field on the right hand, and heard him call in a voice many degrees louder than the speaking trumpet. But the noise was so high in the air that at first I certainly thought it was thunder, whereupon 7 monsters like himself came towards him with reaping hooks in their hands, each hook about the largeness of 6 scythes. These people were not so well clad as the first, whose servants or laborers they seemed to be. For upon some words he spoke, they went to reap the corn in the field where I lay. I kept from them at as great a distance as I could, but was forced to move with extreme difficulty, for the stalks of the corn were sometimes not above a foot distance, so that I could hardly squeeze my body betwixt them. However, I made a shift to go forward until I came to a part of the field where the corn had been laid by the rain and wind. Here was impossible for me to advance a step, for the stalks were so interwoven that I could not creep through, and the beards of the fallen ears so strong and pointed that they pierced through my clothes into my flesh. At the same time I heard the reapers not above 100 yards behind me. Being quite dispirited with toil and wholly overcome by grief and despair, I lay down between 2 ridges, and heartily wished I might there end my days. I bemoaned my desolate widow and fatherless children. I lamented at my own folly and wilfulness in attempting a second voyage against the advice of all my friends and relations. In this terrible agitation of mind I could not forbear thinking of Lilliput, whose inhabitants looked upon me as the greatest prodigy that ever appeared in the world, where I was able to draw an imperial fleet in my hand and perform those other actions which will be recorded forever in the chronicles of that empire, while posterity shall hardly believe them, although attested by millions. I reflected what a mortification it must prove to me to appear as inconsiderable in this nation as one single Lilliputian would be among us. But this I conceived was to be the least of my misfortunes, for as human creatures are observed to be more savage and cruel in proportion to their bulk, what could I expect but to be a morsel in the mouth of the first among these enormous barbarians that should happen to seize me? Undoubtedly, philosophers are in the right when they tell us that nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. It might have pleased fortune to let the Lilliputians find some nation where the people were as diminutive with respect to them as they were to me. And who knows but that even this prodigious race of mortals might be equally overmatched in some distant part of the world, whereof we have yet no discovery. Scared and confounded as I was, I could not forbear going on with these reflections, when one of the reapers approaching within 10 yards of the ridge where I lay, made me apprehend that with the next step I would be squashed to death under his foot, or cut in 2 with his reaping hook. And therefore, when he was again about to move, I screamed as loud as fear could make me. Whereupon the huge creature trod short, and looking round about under him for some time, he last espied me, as I lay on the ground. He considered a while with the caution of one who endeavors to lay hold on a small dangerous animal in such a manner that it shall not be able to either to scratch or to bite him, as I myself has sometimes done with a weasel in England. At length he ventured to take me up behind by the middle between his forefinger and thumb, and brought me within 3 yards of his eyes, that he might behold my shape more perfectly. I guessed his meaning, and my good fortune gave me so much presence of mind that I resolved not to struggle in the least, as he held me in the air about 60 foot from the ground, although he grievously pinched my sides for fear I should slip through his fingers. All I ventured was to raise my eyes towards the sun and place my hands together in a supplicating posture, as to speak some words in a humble, melancholy tone, suitable to the condition I then was in. For I apprehended every moment that he would dash me against the ground, as we usually do any little hateful animal which we have a mind to destroy. By my good star would happen that he appeared pleased with my voice and gestures, and began to look upon me as a curiosity, much wondering to hear me pronounce articulate words, although he could not understand them. In the meantime, I was not able to forbear groaning and shedding tears, and turning my head towards my sides, letting him know, as well as I could, how cruelly I was hurt by the pressure of his thumb and forefinger. He seemed to apprehend my meaning, for, lifting me up in the lapel of his coat, he put me gently upon it, and immediately ran along with me to his master, who was a substantial farmer in the same person I had first seen in the field. The farmer having, as I suppose by their talk, received such an account of me as his servant could give him, took a piece of small straw about the size of a walking staff, and therewith lifted up the lapels of my coat, which it seemed he thought to be some kind of covering that nature had given me. He blew my hairs aside to take a better view of my face. He called his hens about him, and asked them, as I afterward learned, whether they had ever seen in the fields any creature that resembled me. He then placed me softly on the ground upon all four, but I got up immediately and walked slowly backwards and forwards, to let those people see I had no intent to run away. They all sat down in a circle around me, the better to observe my motions. I pulled off my hat and made a low bow towards the farmer. I fell on my knees and lifted up my hands and eyes, and spoke several words as loud as I could. I took a purse of gold out of my pocket, and humbly presented it to him. He received it on the palm of his hand, then applied it close to his eye to see what it was, and afterwards turned it several times with the point of a small pin, which he took out of his sleeve, but could make nothing of it. Whereupon I made a sign that he should place his hand on the ground. I took the purse and opened it, poured all the gold into his palm. There were 6 Spanish pieces of 4 pistoles each, besides 20 or 30 smaller coins. I saw him wet the tip of his little finger upon his tongue, and take up one of my largest pieces, and then another, but he seemed to be wholly ignorant of what they were. He made me a sign to put them again into my purse, and the purse again into my pocket, which after offering to him several times, I thought it best to do. The farmer, by this time, was convinced I must be a rational creature. He spoke often to me, but the sound of his voice pierced my ears, like that of a watermill, yet his words were articulate enough. I answered as loud as I could, in several languages, and he often laid his ear within 2 yards of me, but all in vain, for we were wholly unintelligible to each other. He then sent his servants to their work, and taking his handkerchief out of his pocket, he doubled and spread it upon his left hand, which he placed flat on the ground, with the palm upwards, making me a sign to step into it, as I could easily do, for it was not above a foot in thickness. I thought it my part to obey, and for fear of falling, laid myself at length upon the handkerchief, with the remainder of which he lapped me up to the head for further security, and in this manner carried me home to his house. There he called his wife and showed me to her, but she screamed and ran back, as women in England do at the sight of a toad or spider. However, when she had a while seen my behavior, and how well I observed the signs her husband made, she was soon reconciled, and by degrees grew extremely tender of me. It was about 12 at noon, and a servant brought in dinner. It was only one substantial dish of meat, fit for the plain condition of a husbandman, in a dish of about 24-foot diameter. The company were the farmer and his wife, 3 children, and an old grandmother. When they were sat down, the farmer placed me at some distance from him on the table, which was 30 foot high from the floor. I was in a terrible fright, and kept as far as I could from the edge for fear of falling. The wife minced a bit of meat, then crumbled some bread on it, crumbled some bread on a trencher, and placed it before me. I made her a low bow, took out my knife and fork, and fell to eat, which gave them exceeding delight. The mistress sent her maid for a small dram cup, which held about 3 gallons, filled it with a drink. I took up the vessel, which, with much difficulty in both hands, in a most respectful manner, drank to her ladyship's health, expressing the words as loud as I could in English, which made the company laugh so heartily that I was almost deafened with the noise. This liquor tasted like a small cider, and was not unpleasant. Then the master made me a sign to come to his trencher side, but as I walked on the table, being in great surprise all the time, as the indigent reader will easily conceive and excuse, I happened to stumble against a crust, and fell flat on my face, but received no hurt. I got up immediately, and observing the good people to be in much concern, I took my hat, which I held under my arm out of good manners, and waving it over my head, made 3 huzzas, to show I had got no mischief by my fall, but advancing forwards told my master, as I shall henceforth call him, his youngest son, who sat next to him, an arch boy about 10 years old, took me up by the legs and held me so high in the air that I trembled every limb. But his father snatched me from him, and at the same time gave him such a box on the left ear as would have felled a European troop of horse to the earth, ordering him to be taken from the table. But being afraid the boy might owe me a spite, as well as remembering how mischievous all children among us naturally are to sparrows, rabbits, young kittens, and puppy dogs, I fell on my knees, and pointing to the boy, made my master to understand, as well as I could, that I desired his son might be pardoned. The father complied, and the lad took his seat again, whereupon I went to him and kissed his hand, which my master took and made him stroke me gently with it. In the midst of dinner, my mistress's favorite cat leapt into her lap. I heard a noise behind me like that of a dozen stocking weavers at work, and turning my head, I found it proceeded from the purring of this animal, who seemed to be 3 times larger than that of an ox, as I computed by the view of her head, and one of her paws, while her mistress was feeding and stroking her. The fierceness of this creature's countenance altogether discomposed me, though I stood at the further end of the table, above 50 feet off, and although my mistress held her fast for fear she might give a spring and seize me in her talons. But it happened there was no danger, for the cat took not the least notice of me, when my master placed me within 3 yards of her. And as I have been always told, and found true by experience in my travels, that flying or discovering fear before a fierce animal is a certain way to make it pursue or attack you. So I resolved in this dangerous juncture to show no manner of concern. I walked with intrepidity 5 or 6 times before the very head of the cat, and came within half a yard of her, whereupon she drew herself back, as if she were more afraid of me. I had less apprehension concerning the dogs, whereof 3 or 4 came into the room, as is usual in the farmers' houses, one of which was a mastiff, equal in bulk to 4 elephants, and a greyhound, somewhat taller than the mastiff, but not so large. When dinner was almost done, the nurse came in with a child of a year in her arms, who immediately spied me, and began a squall that you might have heard from London Bridge to Chelsea, after the usual oratory of infants, to get me for a plaything. The mother, out of pure indulgence, took me up and put me towards the child, who presently seized me in the middle, and got my head into his mouth, where I roared so loud that the urchin was frightened and let me drop, and I should infallibly have broke my neck if the mother had not held her apron underneath me. The nurse, to quiet her babe, made use of a rattle, which was a kind of hollow vessel filled with great stones, and fastened by a cable to the child's wrist, but all in vain, so that she was forced to apply the last remedy by giving it suck. I must confess no object ever disgusted me so much as the sight of her monstrous breast, or had a near sight of her, she sitting down the more conveniently to give suck, as I standing on the table. This made me reflect the fair skins of our English ladies, who appear so beautiful to us, only because they are of our own size, and their defects not to be seen but through a magnifying glass, where we find by experiment that the smoothest and whitest skins look rough and coarse and ill-colored. I remember, when I was at Lilliput, the complexion of these diminutive people appeared to me the fairest in the world, and talking upon this subject with a person of learning here, who was an intimate friend of mine, he said that my face appeared much fairer and smoother when he looked on me from the ground than it did upon a nearer view when I took him up into my hand. Then when I took him up into my hand and brought him close, which he confessed was at first a very shocking sight, he said he could discover great holes in my skin, that the stumps of my beard were 10 times stronger than the bristles of a boar, and my complexion made up several colors altogether disagreeable, although I must beg to leave say for myself that I am as fair as most of my sex and country, and very little sunburned by all my travels. On the other side, discoursing of the ladies in the emperor's court, he used to tell me one had freckles, another too wide a mouth, a third too large a nose, nothing of which I was able to distinguish. I confess this reflection was obvious enough, which, however, I could not forbear, lest the reader might think those vast creatures were actually deformed, for I must do them justice to say they are a comely race of people, and particularly the features of my master's countenance, although he were but a farmer, when I beheld him from the height of 60 foot, appeared very well proportioned. When dinner was done, my master went out to his laborers, and I could discover by his voice and gesture gave his wife a strict charge to take care of me. I was very much tired and disposed to sleep. With my mistress perceiving, she put me on her own bed, and covered me with a clean white handkerchief, but larger and coarser than the mainsail of a man of war. I slept about 2 hours, and dreamed I was at home with my wife and children, which aggravated my sorrows when I awakened and found myself alone in a vast room, between 200 and 300 foot wide, and above 200 high, lying in a bed 20 yards wide. My mistress was gone about her household affairs, and had locked me in. The bed was 8 yards from the floor. Some natural necessities required me to get down. I durst not presume to call, and if I had, it would have been in vain, with such a voice of mine, at so great a distance from the room where I lay to the kitchen where the family kept. While I was under these circumstances, two rats crept up the curtains, and ran smelling backwards and forwards on the bed. One of them came up almost to my face, whereupon I rose in a fright and drew out my hanger to defend myself. These horrible animals had the boldness to attack me on both sides, and one of them held his forefeet at my collar, but I had the good fortune to rip up his belly before he could do me any mischief. He fell down at my feet, and the other, seeing the fate of his comrade, made his escape, but not without one good wound on the back, which I gave him as he fled, and made the blood run trickling from him. After this exploit, I walked gently to and fro on the bed, to recover my breath and loss of spirits. These creatures were of the size of a large mastiff, but infinitely more nimble and fierce, so that if I had taken off my belt before I went to sleep, I must have infallibly been torn to pieces and devoured. I measured the tail of the dead rat, and found it to be 2 yards long, wanting an inch, but it went against my stomach to drag the carcass off the bed, where it lay still bleeding. I observed it had yet some life, but with a strong slash across the neck, I thoroughly dispatched it. Soon after, my mistress came into the room, and seeing me all bloody, ran and took me up in her hand. I pointed to the dead rat, smiling and making other signs to show I was not hurt, whereat she was extremely rejoiced. Calling the maid to take up the dead rat with a pair of tongs and throw it out the window. Then she set me on a table, where I showed her my hanger all bloody, and wiping it on the lapel of my coat, returned it to the scabbard. I was pressed to do more than one thing, which another could not do for me, and therefore endeavored to make my mistress understand that I desired to be set down on the floor, which after she had done, my bashfulness would not suffer me to express myself further than by pointing to the door and bowing several times. The good woman, with much difficulty at last, perceived what I would be at, and taking me up again in her hand, walked into the garden, where she set me down. I went on one side about 200 yards, and beckoning to her not to look or to follow me, I hid myself between 2 leaves of sorrel, and there discharged the necessities of nature. I hope the gentle reader will excuse me for dwelling on these and the like particulars, which, however insignificant they may appear to groveling vulgar minds, will certainly help a philosopher to enlarge his thoughts and imagination, and apply them to the benefit of public as well as private life, which was my sole design in presenting this and other accounts of my travels to the world, wherein I have been chiefly studious of truth, without affecting any ornaments of learning or of style. But the whole scene of this voyage made so strong an impression on my mind, and is so deeply fixed in my memory, that in committing it to paper, I did not omit one material circumstance. However, upon a strict review, I blotted out several passages of less moment, which were in my first copy, for fear of being censured as tedious and trifling, whereof travellers are often, perhaps without justice, accused. Chapter 2. My mistress had a daughter of 9 years old, a child of forward parts for her age, very dexterous at her needle, and skilful in dressing her baby. Her mother and she contrived to fit up the baby's cradle for me against night. The cradle was put into a small drawer of a cabinet, and the drawer placed upon a hanging shelf for fear of rats. This was my bed all the time I stayed with those people, though made more convenient by degrees as I began to learn their language and make my wants known. This young girl was so handy that after I had once or twice pulled off my clothes before her, she was able to dress and undress me, though I never gave her the trouble when she would let me do either myself. She made me 7 shirts and some other linen of as fine cloth as she got, which indeed was coarser than sackcloth, and these she constantly washed for me with her own hands. She was likewise my schoolmistress to teach me the language. When I pointed to anything, she told me the name of it in her own tongue, so that in a few days I was able to call for whatever I had a mind to. She was very good-natured, and not above 40 foot high, being little for her age. She gave me the name of Gildrig, which the family took up, and afterwards the whole kingdom. The word imports what the Latins call nanuculus, the Italians homunculento, and the English manikin. To her I chiefly owe my preservation in that country. We never parted while I was there. I called her my Glumdachlich, or little nurse, and I should be guilty of great ingratitude if I omitted this honorable mention of her care and affection towards me, which I heartily wish it lay in my power to recute as she deserves, instead of being the innocent but unhappy instrument of her disgrace, as I have too much reason to fear. It now began to be known and talked of in the neighborhood that my master had found a strange animal in the field, about the bigness of a splachnock, but exactly shaped in every part like a human creature, which it likewise imitated in all its actions, seemed to speak in a little language of its own, had already learned several words of theirs, went erect upon 2 legs, was tame and gentle, would come when it was called, do whatever it was bid, had the finest limbs in the world, and a complexion fairer than a nobleman's daughter of 3 years old. Another farmer, who lived hard by, and was a particular friend to my master, came on a visit on purpose to inquire into the truth of this story. I was immediately produced and placed upon a table, where I walked as I was commanded, drew my hanger, put it up again, made my reverence to my master's guest, and asked him in his own language how he did, and told him he was welcome, just as my little nurse has instructed me. This man, who was old and dim-sighted, put on his spectacles to behold me better, at which I could not forbear laughing very heartily, for his eyes appeared like full moons shining in a chamber at the 2 windows. Our people, who discovered the cause of my mirth, bore me company in laughing, at which the old fellow was fool enough to be angry and out of countenance. He had the character of a great miser, and to my misfortune he well deserved it, by the cursed advice he gave my master to show me as a sight upon a market day in the next town, which was half an hour's riding, about 22 miles from our house. I guess there was some mischief contriving, when I observed my master and his friend whispering along together, sometimes pointing at me, and my fears made me fancy that I overheard and understood some of their words. But the next morning, Glumdachlich, my little nurse, told me the whole matter, which she had cunningly picked out from her mother. The poor girl laid me on her bosom, and fell on a weeping with shame and grief. She apprehended some mischief would happen to me from rude vulgar folks, who might squeeze me to death or break one of my limbs by taking me in their hands. She had also observed how modest I was in my nature, how nicely I regarded my honor, and what indignity I should conceive it to be so exposed for money as a public spectacle to the meanest of the people. She said her papa and mamma had promised that Gildrig should be hers, but now she found they meant to serve her as they did last year, when they pretended to give her a lamb, and yet as soon as it was fat, sold it to a butcher. For my own part, I may truly affirm that I was less concerned with my nurse. I had a strong hope, which never left me, that I should one day recover my liberty. And as to the ignominy of being carried about for a monster, I considered myself to be a perfect stranger in the country, and that such a misfortune could never be charged upon me as reproach. If ever I should return to England, since the King of Great Britain himself, in my condition, must have undergone the same distress. My master, pursuant to the advice of his friend, carried me in a box the next market day to the neighboring town, and took along with him his little daughter, my nurse, upon a pillion behind him. The box was closed on every side, with a little door for me to go in and out, and a few gimlet holes to lend in air. The girl had been so careful to put the quilt of her baby's bed into it, for me to lie down on. However, I was terribly shaken and discomposed in this journey, though it were but of half an hour, for the horse went about 40 foot every step, and trotted so high that the agitation was equal to the rising and falling of a ship in a great storm, but much more frequent. Our journey was somewhat further than from London to St. Albans. My master alighted at an inn which he used to frequent, and after consulting a while with the innkeeper, and making some necessary preparations, he hired the Gultrud, or crier, to give notice through the town of a strange creature to be seen at the sign of the Green Eagle, not so big as a splacknug, an animal in the country very finely shaped, about 6 feet long, and in every part of the body resembling a human creature, could speak several words and perform 100 diverting tricks. I was placed upon a table in the largest room of the inn, which might be near 300 foot square. My little nurse stood on a low stool close to the table to take care of me and direct what I should do. My master, to avoid a crowd, would suffer only 30 people at a time to see me. I walked about on the table as the girl commanded, and asked me questions as far as she knew my understanding of the language reached, and I answered them as loud as I could. I turned about several times to the company, paid my humble respects, and they said they were welcome, and used some other speeches I had been taught. I took up a thimble filled with liquor, which Glumdalclitch had given me for a cup, and drank their health. I drew out my hanger and flourished with it after the manner of fencers in England. My nurse gave me a part of a straw, which I exercised as my pike, having learnt the art in my youth. I was that day shown to 12 sets of company, and as often forced to go over again with the same fopperies, till I was half dead with weariness and vexation. For those who had seen me made such wonderful reports that the people were ready to break down the doors to come in. My master, for his own interest, would not suffer anyone to touch me except my nurse, and, to prevent danger, benches were set round the table at such a distance as put me out of everybody's reach. However, an unlucky schoolboy aimed a hazelnut directly at my head, which very narrowly missed me. Otherwise, it came with so much violence that it would have infallibly knocked out my brains, for it was almost as large as a small pumpkin. But I had the satisfaction to see the young rogue well beaten and turned out of the room. My master gave public notice that he would show me again the next market day, and in the meantime he prepared a more convenient vehicle for me, which he had reason enough to do, for I was so tired with my first journey, and with the entertaining company for 8 hours together, that I could hardly stand upon my legs or speak a word. It was at least 3 days before I recovered my strength, and that I might have no rest at home, all the neighboring gentlemen from 100 miles round, hearing of my fame, came to see me at my master's own house. There could not be fewer than 30 persons with their wives and children, for the country is very populous, and my master demanded the rate of a full room whenever he showed me at home, although it were only a single family, so that for some time I had but little ease every day of the week, except Wednesday, which is their Sabbath, although I were not carried to the town. My master, finding how profitable I was likely to be, resolved to carry me to the most considerable cities in the kingdom. Having therefore provided himself with all things necessary for a long journey, and settled his affairs at home, he took leave of his wife, and upon the 17th of August, 1703, about 2 months after my arrival, we set out for the metropolis, situated near the middle of the empire, and about 3,000 miles distance from our house. My master made his daughter, Glumdalclitch, ride behind him. She carried me on her lap in a box tied about her waist. The girl had lined it on all sides with the softest cloth she could get, well quilted underneath, furnished it with her baby's bed, provided me with linen and other necessities, and made everything as convenient as she could. We had no other company but a boy of the house, who rode after us with the luggage. My master's design was to show me in all the towns by the way, and to step out of the road for 50 or 100 miles to any village or person of quality's house where he might expect custom. We made easy journeys of not above 7 or 8 score miles a day. For Glumdalclitch, on purpose to spare me, complained she was tired with the trotting of the horse. She often took me out of my box at my own desire to give me an air and to show me the country, but always held me fast by a leading string. We passed over 5 or 6 rivers many degrees broader and deeper than the Nile or the Ganges, and there was hardly a rivulet so small as the Thames at London Bridge. We were 10 weeks in our journey, and I was shown in 18 large towns, besides many villages and private families. On the 26th day of October, we arrived at the metropolis, called in their language Lorbelgrud, or Pride of the Universe. My master took a lodging in the principal street of the city, not far from the royal palace, and put out bills in the usual form, containing an exact description of my person and parts. He hired a large room between 300 and 400 foot wide. He provided a table 60 foot in diameter, upon which I was to act my part, and palisadoed it round at 3 foot from the edge, and as many high, to prevent my falling over. I was shown 10 times a day, to the wonder and satisfaction of all people. I could now speak the language tolerably well, and perfectly understood every word that was spoken to me. Besides, I had learnt their alphabet, and could make a shift to explain a sentence here and there, for Glumdalclitch had been my instructor while we were at home and at leisure hours during our journey. She carried a little book in her pocket, not much larger than a Sanson's atlas. It was a common treatise for the use of young girls, giving a short account of their religion. Out of this she taught me my letters and interpreted the words. Chapter 3. The frequent labors I underwent every day made in a few weeks a very considerable change in my health. The more my master got me by me, the more unsatiable he grew. I had quite lost my stomach and was almost reduced to a skeleton. The farmer observed it and concluded I must soon die, resolved to make as good a hand of me as he could. While he was thus reasoning and resolving with himself, a stardrall, or gentleman usher, came from court, commanding my master to carry me immediately thither for the diversion of the queen and her ladies. Some of the latter had already been to see me, and reported strange things of my beauty, behavior, and good sense. Her Majesty and those who attended her were beyond measure delighted by my demeanor. I fell on my knees and begged the honor of kissing her imperial foot, but this gracious princess held out her little finger towards me after I was set on a table, which I embraced in both of my arms and put the tip of it with the utmost respect to my lips. She gave me my general questions about my country and my travels, which I answered as distinctly and in as few words as I could. She asked whether I would be content to live at court. I bowed down to the board of the table and humbly answered that I was my master's slave, but if I were at my own disposal, I should be proud to devote my life to Her Majesty's service. She then asked my master, whether he was willing to sell me at a good price. He, who apprehended I could not live a month, was ready enough to part with me, and demanded 1,000 pieces of gold, which were ordered him on the spot, each piece being about the bigness of 800 moidories, but, allowing for the proportion of all things between that country and Europe, and the high price of gold among them, was hardly so great a sum as 1,000 guineas would be in England. I then said to the Queen, since I was now Her Majesty's most humble creature and vassal, I must beg the favour that Glumdalclitch, who had always tended me with so much care and kindness, and understood to do it so well, might be admitted into her service and continue to be my nurse and instructor. Her Majesty agreed to my petition and easily got the farmer's consent, who was glad enough to have his daughter preferred at court, and the poor girl herself was not able to hide her joy. My late master withdrew, bidding me farewell, and saying he had left me in good service, to which I replied not a word, only making him a slight bow. The queen observed my coldness, and when the farmer was gone out of the apartment, asked me the reason. I made bold to tell her Majesty that I owed her. I made bold to tell her Majesty that I owed no other obligation to my late master than his not dashing out the brains of a poor harmless creature found by chance in his field, which obligation was amply recompensed by the gain he had made in showing me through half the kingdom, and the price he had now sold me for. That the life I had since led was laborious enough to kill an animal of 10 times my strength, that my health was much impaired to the continual drudgery of entertaining the rabble every hour of the day, and that if my master had not thought my life in danger, her Majesty perhaps would not have got so cheap a bargain. But as I was out of fear of being ill-treated under the protection of so great and good an empress, or the ornament of nature, the darling of the world, the delight of her subjects, the phoenix of the creation, so I hoped my late master's apprehensions would appear to be groundless, for I already found my spirits to revive by the influence of her most august presence. This was the sum of my speech, delivered with great improprieties and hesitation. The latter part was altogether framed in the style particular to that people, whereof I learned some phrases from Glumdalclitch while she was carrying me to court. The queen, giving great allowance for my defectiveness in speaking, was however surprised at so much wit and good sense in so diminutive an animal. She took me in her own hand and carried me to the king, who was then retired to his cabinet. His Majesty, a prince of much gravity and austere countenance, not well observing my shape at first view, asked the queen, after a cold manner, how long it was since she grew fond of a splachnak, for such it seems he took me to be, as I lay upon my breast in her Majesty's right hand. But this princess, who hath an infinite deal of wit and humour, set me gently on my feet upon the scrotre, and commanded me to give his Majesty an account of myself, which I did in a very few words. And Glumdalclitch, who attended at the cabinet door, and could not endure I should be out of her sight, being admitted, confirmed all that had passed from my arrival at her father's house. The king, although he be learned a person as any in his dominions, had been educated in the study of philosophy, and particularly mathematics. Yet when he observed my shape exactly, and saw me walk erect before I began to speak, conceived I might be a piece of clockwork, which is in that country arrived to a great perfection, contrived by some ingenious artist. But when he heard my voice, and found what I delivered to be regular and rational, he could not conceal his astonishment. He was by no means satisfied with the relation I gave him of the manner I came into the kingdom, but thought it a story concerted between Glumdalclitch and her father, who had taught me the set of words to make me sell at a higher price. Upon this imagination he put several other questions to me, and still received rational answers, no otherwise defective than by foreign accent, and by an imperfect knowledge in the language, with some rustic phrases which I had learned from the farmer's house, and did not suit the polite style of court. His Majesty sent for 3 great scholars, who were then in their weekly waiting, according to the custom in that country. These gentlemen, after they had a while examined my shape with much nicety, were of different opinions concerning me. They all agreed that I could not be produced according to the regular laws of nature, because I was not framed for the capacity of preserving my life either by swiftness or climbing of trees or digging holes in the earth. They observed by my teeth, which they viewed with great exactness, that I was a carnivorous animal, yet most quadrupeds being an overmatch for me, and field mice, with some others, too nimble. They could not imagine how I should be able to support myself, unless I fed upon snails and other insects, which they offered, by many learned arguments, to evince that I could not possibly do. One of these virtuosi, seemed to think that I might be an embryo or abortive birth, but this opinion was rejected by the other two, who observed my limbs to be perfect and finished, and that I had lived several years, as it was manifest from my beard, the stumps whereof they plainly discovered through a magnifying glass. They would not allow me to be a dwarf, because my littleness was beyond all degrees for comparison. For the queen's favorite dwarf, the smallest ever known in that kingdom, was nearly 30 foot high. After much debate, they concluded unanimously that it was only a Röplum Skalkax, which is interpreted literally lusus naturae, or a freak of nature. A determination exactly agreeable to the modern philosophy of Europe, whose professors, disdaining the old evasion of occult causes, whereby the followers of Aristotle endeavor in vain to disguise their ignorance, have invented this wonderful solution of all differences, of all difficulties, to unspeakable advancement of human knowledge. After this device conclusion, I entreated to be heard a word or two. I applied myself to the king, and assured his majesty that I came from a country abounded with several millions of both sexes and of my own stature, where all animals, trees, and houses were all in proportion, and where by consequence I might be as able to defend myself and to find sustenance as any of his majesty's subjects could do here, which I took for a full answer to those gentlemen's arguments. To this they only replied with a smile of contempt, saying that the farmer had instructed me very well in my lesson. The king, who had a much better understanding, dismissing his learned men, sent for the farmer, who by good fortune was not yet gone out of town. Having therefore first examined him privately, and then confronting him with me and the young girl, his majesty began to think that what we had told him might possibly be true. He desired the queen to order that a particular care should be taken of me, and was of opinion that Glumdalclitch should still continue in her office of tending me, because he observed we had a great affection for each other. A convenient apartment was provided for her at court. She had a sort of governess appointed to take care of her education, a maid to dress her, and 2 other servants for menial offices. But the care of me was wholly appropriated to herself. The queen commanded her own cabinet maker to contrive a box that might serve me for a bedchamber, but after the model that Glumdalclitch and I should agree upon. This man was a most ingenious artist, and according to my directions, in 3 weeks finished for me a wooden chamber of 16 foot square and 12 high, with sash windows, a door, and 2 closets, like a London bedchamber. The board that made up the ceiling was to be lifted up and down by 2 hinges, to be put into a bed ready furnished by Her Majesty's upholsterer, which Glumdalclitch took out every day to air, made it with her own hands, and letting it down at night, locked up the roof over me. A nice workman, who was famous for little curiosities, undertook to make me 2 chairs, with backs and frames of a substance not unlike ivory, and 2 tables with a cabinet to put my things on. The room was quilted on all sides, as well as the floor and the ceiling, to prevent any accident from the carelessness of those who carried me, and to break the force of a jolt when I went in a coach. I desired a lock for my door to prevent rats and mice from coming in. The smith, after several attempts, made the smallest that ever was seen among them, for I have known a larger at the gate of the gentleman's house in Europe. I made a shift to keep the key in a pocket of my own, fearing Glumdalclitch might lose it. The queen likewise ordered the thinnest silks that could be gotten, to make me clothes not much thicker than an English blanket, very cumbersome till I was accustomed to them. They were after the fashion of the kingdom, partially resembling the Persian and partially the Chinese, and are a very grave and decent habit. The queen became so fond of my company that she could not dine without me. I had a table placed upon the same at which Her Majesty ate, just at her left elbow, and a chair to sit on. Glumdalclitch stood upon a stool on the floor, near my table, to assist and take care of me. I had an entire set of silver dishes and plates and other necessaries, which, in proportion to those of the queen, were not much bigger than what I have seen on the same kind in a London toy shop, for the furniture of a baby house. Those my little nurse kept in her pocket in a silver box, and gave me at meals as I wanted them, always cleaning them herself. No person dined with the queen but the 2 princes royal, the elder 16 years old, and the younger at that time 13 and a month. Her Majesty used to put a bit of meat upon one of the dishes, out of which I carved for myself, and her diversion was to see me eat in miniature. For the Queen, who had indeed but a weak stomach, took up at one mouthful as much as a dozen English farmers could eat at a meal, which to me was for some time a very nauseous sight. She would crunch the wing of a lark, bones and all, between her teeth, although it were 9 times as large as that of a full-grown turkey, and put a bit of bread in her mouth as big as 2 12-penny loaves. She drank out of a golden cup above a hogshead at a draught. Her knives were twice as long as a scythe, set straight upon the handle. The spoons, forks, and other instruments were all in the same proportion. I remember when Glumdalclitch carried me out of curiosity to see some of the tables at court, where 10 or a dozen of these enormous knives and forks were lined up together. I thought I had never till then beheld so terrible a sight. It was the custom that every Wednesday, which I have been before observed, was their Sabbath. The king and queen, with the royal issue of both sexes, dined together in the apartment of his Majesty, to whom I was now become a great favorite, and at these times my little chair and table were placed at his left hand, before one of the salt cellars. This prince took a pleasure in conversing with me, inquiring into the manners, religion, laws, government, and learning of Europe, wherein I gave him the best account I was able. His apprehension was so clear, and his judgment so exact, that he made very wise reflections and observations upon all I said. But I confess that after I had been a little too copious in talking of my own beloved country, of our trade, and wars by sea and land, of our schisms in religion, and parties in the state, the prejudices of his education prevailed so far that he could not forbear taking me up in his right hand, and stroking me gently with the other. After a hearty fit of laughing, asked me whether I were a Whig or a Tory. A Whig or a Tory. Then, turning to his first minister, who waited behind him, with a white staff as near as tall as the mainmast of the royal sovereign, he observed how contemptible a thing was human grandeur, which could be mimicked by such a diminutive insects as I. And yet, said he, I dare engage these creatures of their titles and distinctions of honor. They contrive little nests and burrows, that they call houses and cities, make a figure in dress and equipage. They love, they fight, they dispute, they cheat, they betray. And thus he continued on, while my color came and went several times with indignation to hear our noble country, the mistress of arts and arms, the scourge of France, the arbitress of Europe, the seat of virtue, piety, honor, and truth, the pride and envy of the world, so contemptuously treated. But I was not in a condition to resent injuries. So, upon mature thoughts, I began to doubt whether I were injured or no, for, having been accustomed several months to the sight and converse of these people, and observed every object upon which I cast my eyes to be of proportionable magnitude, the horror I had first conceived from their bulk and aspect was so far worn off, that if I had then beheld a company of English lords and ladies in their finery and birthday clothes, acting their several parts in the most courtly manner of strutting and prating, to say the truth, I should have been strongly tempted to laugh. As much at them as the king and his grandees did at me. Neither indeed could I forbear smiling at myself when the queen used to place me upon her hand towards a looking glass, by which both her persons appeared before me in full view together, and there could be nothing more ridiculous than the comparison, so that I really began to imagine myself dwindled many degrees below my usual size. Nothing angered and mortified me so much as the queen's dwarf, who being of the lowliest stature that was ever in the country, for I verily think he was not full 30 foot high, became insolent at seeing a creature so much beneath him, that he would always affect to swagger and look big as he passed by me in the queen's antechamber, while I was standing on some table, talking with the lords or ladies of the court. And he seldom failed of a smart word or two upon my littleness, against which I could only revenge myself by calling him brother, challenging him to wrestle and such repartees as are usual in the mouths of court pages. One day at dinner, this malicious little cub was so nettled with something I had said to him that, raising himself upon the frame of Her Majesty's chair, he took me up by my middle as I was sitting down, not thinking any harm, and let me drop into a large silver bowl of cream, and then ran away as fast as he could. I fell over head and ears, and if I had not been a good swimmer, might have gone very hard with me. For Glumdalclitch in that instant happened to be at the other end of the room, and the queen was in such a fright that she wanted presence of mind to assist me. But my little nurse ran to my relief and took me out. After I had swallowed above a quart of cream, I was put to bed. However, I received no other damage than the loss of a suit of clothes, which was utterly spoiled. The dwarf was soundly whipped, and as a further punishment, forced to drink up the bowl of cream into which he had thrown me. Neither was he ever restored to favor, for soon after the queen bestowed him to a lady of high quality, so that I saw him no more, to my very great satisfaction, for I could not tell to what extremity such a malicious urchin might have carried his resentment. He had before served me a scurvy trick, which set the queen a-laughing, while at the same time she were heartily vexed, and would have immediately cashiered him, if I had not been so generous as to intercede. Her Majesty had taken a marrow-bone upon her plate, and after knocking out the marrow, placed the bone again in the dish erect as it stood before. The dwarf, watching his opportunity, while Glumdalclitch was gone to the sideboard, mounted upon the stool she stood on to take care of me at meals, took me in both hands, and squeezed my legs together, wedged them into the marrow-bone above my waist, where I stuck for some time, and made a very ridiculous figure. I believe it was near a minute before anyone knew what was become of me, for I thought it below me to cry out. But as princes seldom get their meat hot, my legs were not scalded, only my stockings and breeches in a sad condition. The dwarf, at my entreaty, had no other punishment than a sound whipping. I was frequently rallied by the queen upon accident for my fearfulness, as she used to ask me whether the people of my country were as great cowards as myself. The occasion was this. The kingdom is much pestered with flies in summer, and these odious insects, each of them as big as a Dunstable lark, hardly gave me any rest while I sat at dinner. With their continual humming and buzzing about my ears, they would sometimes alight upon my victuals, and leave their loathsome excrement or spawn behind, which to me was very visible, though not to the natives of the country, whose large optics were not so acute as mine in viewing smaller objects. Sometimes they would fix upon my nose or forehead, where they stung me to the quick, smelling very offensively, and I could easily trace the vicious matter, which our naturalists tell us enables those creatures to walk with their feet upwards upon a ceiling. I had much ado to defend myself against these detestable animals. I could not forbear starting when they came on my face. It was a common practice to the dwarf to catch a number of those insects in his hand, as schoolboys do among us, and let them out so suddenly under my nose, on purpose to frighten me and divert the queen. My remedy was to cut them in pieces with my knife as they flew in the air, wherein my dexterity was much admired. I remember one morning when Glumdalclitch had set me in my box upon a window, as she usually did in fair days to give me air, for I durst not venture to let the box be hung on a nail up the window, as we do with cages in England. After I had lifted up one of my sashes and sat down at my table to eat a piece of sweet cake for my breakfast, above 20 wasps, allured by the smell, came flying into the room, humming louder than the drones of as many bagpipes. Some of them seized my cake and carried it piecemeal away. Others flew about my head and face, confounding me with the noise, and putting me in the utmost terror of their stings. I had the courage to rise and draw my hanger, and attack them in the air. I dispatched 4 of them, but the rest got away, and I presently shut my window. These insects were as large as partridges. I took out their stings and found them 1.5 inches long, and as sharp as needles. I carefully preserved them all, and having since shown them with some other curiosities in several parts of Europe. Upon my return to England, I gave 3 of them to the Gersham College, and kept the fourth for myself. Chapter 4. I now intend to give the reader a short description of this country, as far as I travelled in it, which was not above 2,000 miles round Lorbrulgrud, the metropolis. For the Queen, whom I always attended, never went further when she accompanied the King in his progress, and there stayed till his Majesty returned from viewing his frontiers. The whole exact of this prince's domains reacheth about 6,000 miles in length, and from 3 to 5 in breadth. From whence I cannot but conclude that our geographers of Europe are in a great error by supporting nothing but the sea between Japan and California. For it was ever my opinion that there must be a balance of earth to counterpose the great continent of Tartary, and therefore they ought to correct their maps and charts by joining this vast tract of land to the northwest parts of America. Wherein I shall be ready to lend them my assistance. The kingdom is a peninsula, terminated to the northeast by a ridge of mountains 30 miles high, which are altogether impassable by reason of the volcanoes upon the tops. Neither do the most learned know what sort of mortals inhabit beyond these mountains, or whether they be inhabited at all. On the 3 other sides it is bounded by the ocean. There is not one seaport in the whole kingdom, and those parts of the coasts into which the rivers issue are so full of pointed rocks, and the sea generally so rough, that there is no venturing with the smallest of their boats, so that these people are wholly excluded from any commerce with the rest of the world. But the large rivers are full of vessels and abound with excellent fish, for they seldom get any from the sea, because the sea fish are of the same size with those in Europe, consequently not worth catching. Whereby it is manifest that nature, in the production of plants and animals of so extraordinarily in bulk, is wholly confined to this continent, of which I leave the reasons to be determined by philosophers. However, now and then they take a whale that happens to be dashed upon the rocks, which the common people feed on heartily. These whales I have known so large that a man could hardly carry one upon his shoulders, and sometimes for curiosity they are brought in hampers to Lorbrulgrud. I saw one of them in a dish at the king's table, which passed for a rarity, but I did not observe he was fond of it, for I think indeed the bigness disgusted him, although I have seen one somewhat larger in Greenland. The country is well inhabited, for it contains 51 cities, near 100 walled towns, and a great number of villages. To satisfy my curious reader, it may be sufficient to describe Lorbrulgrud. This city stands upon almost 2 equal parts on each side of the river that passes through. It contains above 80,000 houses, and about 600,000 inhabitants. It is the length of 3 longlungs, which make about 54 English miles, and 2.5 in breadth, as I measured it myself in the royal map made by the king's order, which was laid on the ground on purpose for me, and extended 100 feet. I paced the diameter and circumference by several times barefoot, and computing by the scale, measured it pretty exactly. The king's palace is no regular edifice, but a heap of buildings about 7 miles around. The chief rooms are generally 240 feet high, and broad and long in proportion. A coach was allowed to Glumdalclitch and me, wherein her governess frequently took her out to see the town, or go among shops, and I was always of the party. Carried in my box, although the girl at my own desire would often take me out, and hold me in her hand, that I might more conveniently view the houses and the people as we pass along the streets. I reckoned our coach to be about a square of Westminster Hall, but not altogether so high. However, I cannot be very exact. One day the governess ordered our coachman to stop at several shops, where the beggars, watching their opportunity, crowded to the sides of the coach, then gave me the most horrible spectacles that ever an Englishman eye had beheld. There was a woman with a cancer in her breast, swelled to a monstrous size, full of holes, in 2 or 3 of which I could have easily crept, and covered my whole body. There was a fellow with a wean in his neck, larger than 5 woolpacks, and another with a couple of wooden legs, each about 20 feet high. But the most hateful sight of all was the lice crawling on their clothes. I could see distinctly the limbs of these vermin with my naked eye, much better than those of a European louse through a microscope, and their snouts, with which they rooted like swine. They were the first I have ever beheld, so I should have been curious enough to dissect one, if I had proper instruments, which I unluckily left behind me on the ship, although indeed the sight was so nauseous that it perfectly turned my stomach. Besides the large box in which I was usually carried, the Queen ordered a smaller one to be made for me, of about 12 foot square and 10 high for the convenience of traveling, because the other was somewhat too large for Glumdalclitch's lap, and cumbersome in the coach. It was made by the same artist whom I directed in the whole contrivance. This traveling closet was an exact square, with a window in the middle of 3 of the squares, and each window was latticed with iron wire on the outside to prevent accidents in long journeys. On the fourth side, which had no windows, 2 strong staples were fixed, through which the person that carried me, when I had a mind to be on horseback, put in a leathern belt and buckled it about his waist. This was always the office of some grave trusty servant in whom I could confide, whether I attended the king and queen in their progress, or was disposed to see the gardens, or pay a visit to some great lady or minister of state in the court, when Glumdalclitch happened to be out of order. For I soon began to be known and esteemed among the great officers, I suppose more upon account of their majesties' favour than any merit of my own. In journeys, when I was weary of the coach, a servant on horseback would buckle my box and place it on a cushion before him, and there I had the full prospect of the country. On 3 sides from my 3 windows, I had in this closet a field bed and a hammock hung from the ceiling, 2 chairs and a table, neatly screwed to the floor, to prevent being tossed about by the agitation of the horse or the coach. And having been long used to sea voyages, these motions, although sometimes very violent, did not much decompose me. When I had a mind to see the town, it was always in my travelling closet, which Glumdalclitch held in her lap in a kind of open sedan, after the fashion of the country, borne by 4 men and attended by 2 others in the Queen's livery. The people who had often heard of me were very curious to crowd around the sedan. The girl was complaisant enough to make the bearer stop and to take me in her hand that I might be more conveniently seen. I was very desirous to see the chief temple, and particularly the tower belonging to it, which is reckoned the highest in the kingdom. Accordingly, one day my nurse carried me thither, but I may truly say I came back disappointed, for the height is not above 3,000 foot, reckoning from the top ground to the highest pinnacle top, which, allowing for the difference between the size of these people and us in Europe, is no matter for admiration. For at all equal in proportion, if I rightly remember, to Stelsbury's steeple, but not to detract from a nation to which during my life I shall acknowledge myself extremely obliged, it must be allowed that whether this famous tower wants in height is amply made up in beauty and strength, for the walls are near 100 foot thick, built of hewn stone, wherever each is about 40 foot square, and adorned on all sides with statues of gods and emperors cut in marble, larger than life, placed in their several niches. I measured a little finger which had fallen down from one of these statues, and lay unperceived among some rubbish, and found it exactly 4 foot and an inch in length. Glumdalclitch wrapped it up in a handkerchief, and carried it home in her pocket to keep among other trinkets, of which the girl was very fond, as children at her age usually are. The king's kitchen is indeed a noble building, vaulted at the top and about 600 foot high. The great oven is not so wide by 10 paces as the cupola at St. Paul's, for I measured the latter on purpose after my return. But if I should describe the kitchen's grate, the prodigious pots and kettles, the joints of meat turning on the spits, with many other particulars, perhaps I should be hardly believed. At least a severe critic would be apt to think I enlarged a little, as travellers are often suspected to do. To avoid which censure, I fear I have run too much into the other extreme, and that if this treatise should happen to be translated into the language of Brobdingnag, which is the general name of that kingdom, and transmitted thither, the king and his people would have reason to complain that I had done them an injury by false and diminutive representation. His Majesty seldom keeps above 600 horses in his stables. They are generally from 54 to 60 feet high, but when he goes abroad on solemn days, he is attended for state by a militia guard of 500 horse, which indeed I thought was the most splendid sight that could ever be beheld, till I saw part of his army in Patalia, whereof I shall find another occasion to speak.